Episode 1. The Birth of Sacred Fear. Imagine for a moment a system so perfect it never needs to prove anything. A mechanism capable of controlling entire societies without offering evidence, only promises. Promises pushed off until after death. No merchant, no ruler, no magician could have invented something this effective, but someone did. And that's how organized religion was born. An invisible scam, armored against time, built on the most primitive fear of the human being, fear of the unknown. How could something so intangible rule millions of people for millennia? Darkness, wind. A thunderclap splits the night. Fire flickers in the middle of a small Paleolithic tribe. Faces are frozen in panic, hands are shaking. No one understands what's happening. They just feel that something powerful and terrible is manifesting in the sky. Among them, someone stands up, raises their arms, and mutters incomprehensible sounds. In that moment, that gesture turns them into an interpreter. What is chaos for everyone else, they turn into a divine message. Right there appears the first religious figure, the mediator between the human and the sacred. Over 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic, humans start farming, domesticating animals, forming villages. But none of that removes their fragility. A drought can wipe out an entire community. A plague can destroy the harvest. An unknown disease can take the children in a matter of days. Faced with that vulnerability, the most powerful explanation wasn't scientific. It didn't exist yet. It was spiritual. Thunder was read as the anger of the gods, a bad harvest as punishment, death as a sign of impurity. And whoever knew how to narrate those events in sacred terms gained obedience. The first offerings weren't random. People offered grain, animals, even human lives to appease the invisible. It wasn't a fair trade. The people gave what was tangible. The priest handed over what was intangible. But the real genius of the system was something else. It wasn't enough to demand visible sacrifices. An invisible debt had to be invented. The promise of another life after this one. A life no one could verify or claim back. It was the perfect contract. No tool seller could ever scam like that because the flaw would be obvious immediately. But religion pushed verification into an impossible territory, the afterlife. The first mud and stone temples rose like stages. Rituals, dances, repetitive chants played out inside. It wasn't just devotion, it was theater. Theater designed to wrap the mind and body in a collective trance. What began as tribal superstition soon turned into an institution. And that institution became the backbone of the first civilizations. We fast forward to Mesopotamia, in the 4th millennium before our era. There, ziggurats rose toward the sky like giant staircases to reach the gods. The priests didn't just handle rituals, they controlled writing, calendars, agriculture, justice. Religion stopped being just belief and became administration. A web of power that blurred into the state itself. The people handed over obedience, crops, and tribute. In return, they got the promise of divine protection. It was an unequal contract, but accepted as natural. The scene is crystal clear, half-starved peasants laying offerings at the feet of colossal temples, while priests carefully record the growing wealth on clay tablets. Gold and resources concentrate in the hands of a few, while the crowd accepts that inequality as divine will. The trick was flawless. The abundance of the temples wasn't seen as theft, but as a sign of heavenly favor. Here, the first great formula of the scam is set in place. Earthly power is legitimized through spiritual power. The priest becomes the indispensable bridge between the people and the invisible. Without him, life has no meaning. Death is pure terror. The future, unbearable uncertainty. With him, everything suddenly seems to have an explanation and a purpose. The price is submission. And yet, the most disturbing part is still to come, because this structure not only survives for thousands of years, it learns to expand, to adapt, and to control not only fear, but also morality, politics, and even the very identity of entire peoples. The story is just getting started. The question is unavoidable. How did religion turn fear into an empire capable of shaping entire civilizations? The answer is in the next chapter. If this story is making you see things differently, tell me what you think about all this in the comments. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. What's coming in the next episode will reveal how pharaohs and kings used religion as their most powerful weapon of control. Episode 2: The Throne and the Altar. You can't understand the history of religion without looking at palaces and crowns, because from very early on, rulers realized that fear and hope could become allies of their authority. If thunder could be interpreted as a message from the gods, why not the voice of the king too? Religion didn't just comfort people. It became the most effective tool to shield political power. Picture Egypt more than 4,000 years ago. On the banks of the Nile, the sun rises over pyramids still under construction. Crowds haul stones under unbearable heat, convinced that their effort isn't just human labor, but a divine duty. The pharaoh isn't just a monarch. He's a god on earth. His word isn't debated, it's worshipped. Here religion plays its MasterCard, legitimizing inequality as a heavenly mandate. In Mesopotamia, the story isn't that different. The kings of Babylon and Assyria claimed their power came directly from the gods. Laws weren't presented as social agreements, but as sacred revelations. The famous Code of Hammurabi, carved nearly 4 millennia ago, doesn't start by describing human justice, but by declaring that the king was chosen by the gods to guide his people. So obeying the ruler wasn't just obeying a man, it was obeying heaven itself. The trick was subtle and perfect. Any political opposition turned into sacrilege. Criticizing the king was blasphemy. Doubting authority was flirting with divine wrath. With this fusion of altar and throne, politics became bulletproof against dissent. No repressive system could have achieved that level of control without that sacred coding. In ancient China, emperors claimed the so-called mandate of heaven. As long as harvests were good and peace reigned, people believed the gods blessed their rule. If famines or rebellions broke out, it was read as a sign that the emperor had lost divine favor. It was a control mechanism that turned power into something not just political, but cosmic. The people accepted obedience as part of a universal order. In India, the caste system solidified under the backing of sacred texts. Inequality was justified as part of a hierarchy established by the gods. Being born in a low position wasn't human injustice, it was the result of actions in past lives. Religion offered the perfect explanation to perpetuate rigid structures. There was no need to rebel. You just had to accept. The camera now travels to Rome. There, emperors understood that legions alone weren't enough to rule such a vast territory. They proclaimed themselves Pontifex Maximus, high priests of the official cult. By merging military power with spiritual power, they ensured obedience didn't only depend on swords, but on faith. When Constantine, in the 4th century of our era, adopted Christianity as the official religion, it wasn't just out of personal conviction. It was a strategic move. Unify the empire under a common creed. Turn faith into political cement. The pattern is obvious. Divinized pharaohs, kings anointed by priests, emperors presented as intermediaries of heaven. They all understood the same formula. Whoever controls religion controls the minds of their subjects. Because fear of death and hope for salvation are far more effective weapons than any army, religion became the invisible engine behind crowns and scepters. People obeyed, convinced it was a moral duty, when in reality they were feeding a machine of political domination. That alliance between throne and altar sealed the fate of entire civilizations for centuries. And the unsettling part is that even today we can still see its traces. But the story goes even deeper, because it wasn't enough to legitimize the power of kings and emperors. Religion took one more step. It claimed the exclusive role of moral guardian. As if before it, there had been nothing but chaos and barbarism. Was it really like that? In the next episode, we'll see how religion monopolized ethics to tighten its control. Episode 3: The Monopoly on Morality. When a system of power manages not only to govern bodies but also consciences, its rule becomes almost absolute. And that's exactly what religion achieved. It wasn't content with being the voice of the gods or the ally of kings and emperors. It went further and claimed a much more intimate territory: morality. It managed to convince the world that without religion, there would be no justice, no compassion, no solidarity. It presented itself as the exclusive guardian of good and evil, as if before its commandments, there had only been chaos. But the truth is very different. Morality wasn't born in temples, but long before. Imagine hunter-gatherer peoples, thousands of years before writing, without organized religions. They already shared food, cared for the injured, punished those who endangered the tribe. Cooperation didn't come from sacred tablets or oracles. It came from the basic need to survive in community. The instinct for mutual help was there before any priest existed. Yet religions took that collective heritage, wrapped it in symbols, and turned it into the exclusive property of their gods. The most famous example is the 10 Commandments in the Hebrew world. Banning murder, theft, adultery, or false testimony were not new ideas. These were already common practices in earlier societies, because no community could survive under total chaos. But by framing them as divine mandates, religion introduced a decisive change. Whoever broke the rules wasn't just failing their group, they were defying God himself. Disobedience stopped being a human conflict and became a cosmic crime. The strategy was brilliant. If morality belongs to the gods, then priests are their indispensable interpreters. No one can argue with their laws because doing so is basically going against the order of the universe. That way, religion closed the circle. It dominated politics, controlled access to knowledge, and now dictated what was right and what was sin. In ancient Greece, while philosophers debated justice, virtue, and wisdom, temples imposed rituals and sacrifices as forms of moral purification. Socrates dared to question established beliefs and ended up sentenced to death. In Rome, civil laws coexisted with the decrees of the gods, and later on, with Christianity as the official religion, moral dogmas became institutionalized in every corner of daily life. Medieval Europe is perhaps the most extreme example of this monopoly. For centuries, the church not only regulated behaviors, but also thoughts. Any idea that strayed from doctrine was heresy, and heresy was punished with prison, torture, or death. Books were burned, philosophers persecuted, scientists silenced. Morality turned into a constant surveillance tool, more powerful than any army. Because the eye of God, people were told, saw everything, even what no one else could see. Desires, thoughts, secret doubts. Manipulation reached the deepest intimacy. Sexuality, for example, was surrounded with strict rules that turned something natural into a source of guilt. The body, celebrated in other cultures, became seen as a fountain of sin. Religion infiltrated the most intimate sphere of existence, controlling not just actions but emotions and impulses. The genius of this mechanism lay in the invisible punishment. Political power didn't need to be watching all the time, because the person's own conscience became the prison. A medieval peasant could be alone in a field, but still feel God watching him. It wasn't human law holding him back. It was fear of eternal judgment. That's how obedience became voluntary, sustained by the believer's own mind. And here a fascinating dilemma appears. What happens when someone silently starts to doubt? Religion had already anticipated that crack. It planted in every individual the idea that questioning was dangerous, not just for them, but for their family and community. So doubt became betrayal, and very few could bear that weight. Even those who suspected the scam preferred to stay quiet, rather than risk moral condemnation. The most disturbing part is that this moral monopoly is still alive today. In many parts of the world, questioning religious dogmas is still punished with prison or even death. And even in more secular societies, religions still claim authority over ethical debates, from marriage to reproduction, from education to politics. The old trick repeats itself, presenting themselves as guardians of morality in order to shield their privileges. But there's a question we still haven't answered. How did religion extend that control not only into the present, but also into the future, making sure the next generations were born already inside the same net? The answer lies in an even more delicate territory: childhood. In the next episode, we'll see how early indoctrination turned millions of children into guardians of the same prison that trapped them. Episode 4: The Conquest of Childhood. If fear is religion's raw material, childhood is the most fertile ground where it can plant its seeds. An adult can resist, question, rebel. A child absorbs images, stories, and symbols with no filters. The real genius of religions wasn't just controlling the living, but making sure each generation inherited the same faith as if it were a natural part of their identity. Imagine an ancient village. Tiny children, barely able to speak, are taken before an altar. There they hear stories about paradises and punishments, divine heroes and invisible demons lurking in the dark. To adult eyes, these might look like harmless tales. To a child's mind, their molds burned in deep. Heaven and hell stop being metaphors and become unquestionable realities. In Egypt, from their earliest years, children learned that the pharaoh wasn't just a king, but a living god. They grew up repeating rituals, watching processions and offerings that hammered that idea in. In Greece and Rome, myths were told from the cradle, woven into songs and games. In medieval Europe, children heard sermons about original sin. They learned to pray before sleeping and grew up certain that their soul could burn forever if they didn't obey. Education was not neutral. It was emotional training designed to mold obedient identities. Religion understood something that modern advertising also exploits. What you learn in childhood walks with you for life. Those first emotional imprints are the most lasting. So the images of angels and demons, paradises and punishments, divine heroes and prophets, turn into invisible scars that stay with a person for decades. The mechanism was perfect. A child who grows up repeating prayers, memorizing hymns, and joining processions doesn't distinguish between faith and culture, between dogma and family. Religion gets embedded right in the core of their identity. Questioning those beliefs as an adult feels like betraying not only the gods, but also your parents, your community, the memory of your ancestors. Even those who silently doubt often choose to stay inside the circle. The emotional cost of breaking with the faith is simply too high. Early indoctrination created an even more unsettling phenomenon. The believers themselves became the system's guards. A teenager who grew up convinced that obedience was a virtue turns into an adult ready to defend that structure with teeth and nails. Religion doesn't always need to be imposed from above. It's enough to plant it in childhood and let each generation pass it on like a family treasure. The victims end up as the most loyal soldiers of their own prison. This process was reinforced with collective rituals. Baptisms, initiations, circumcisions, coming-of-age ceremonies. Each one marked the child's life with visible symbols of belonging. And as they grew up, those same individuals would repeat the cycle with their own children, convinced they were passing on not just tradition, but salvation. That's how religion found its strongest shield, emotional lineage. Childhood became a spiritual battlefield. It wasn't just about gaining believers, it was about making sure every generation was already shaped from birth. That's why so many religions obsess over catching them. Young because they know an adult can choose, but a child will believe without question. And so, another inevitable question appears. How did this massive indoctrination manage to stay intact, even when new voices tried to question the system? How were questions, doubts, and intellectual rebellions smothered? The answer lies in one of the darkest chapters in human history: control of information. In the next episode, we'll see how religion, in order to protect its power, persecuted thinkers, burned books, and domesticated thought for centuries, building a wall against any threat from knowledge. Episode 5: Imposed Silence, the censorship of thought. By this point in the story, religion had already learned how to rule through fear, prop up kings and pharaohs, and claim morality as its private property. But one key piece of its empire was still missing: control of thought. Because what happens when someone dares to ask too many questions? What happens when a man or woman decides to watch the stars, experiment with nature, or simply question sacred stories? The answer is clear. For centuries, Religion built a censorship machine designed to smother any spark of doubt before it could catch fire. Imagine a world where books are dangerous, where reading certain texts can cost you your life. That world isn't fiction. It was real for much of the Middle Ages, and still is in some countries today. To maintain its dominance, religion understood it had to block access to any knowledge that threatened its narrative. As long as people lived in ignorance, dogmas would keep looking unquestionable. In Alexandria, over 2,000 years ago, the legendary library gathered knowledge from many cultures: math, astronomy, philosophy, medicine. It was a beacon of learning, but religious hostility toward anything that didn't fit their scriptures fueled fires and sackings that destroyed much of that legacy. It wasn't the only case. Throughout history, countless manuscripts were turned to ash for being heretical. Every burned book was a door slammed shut on another way of seeing the world. During the Middle Ages, the Church in Europe created Inquisition tribunals. Their mission: identify, hunt down, and punish anyone who dared challenge orthodoxy. Philosophers, doctors, astronomers, and even simple peasants who doubted the sermons were denounced, interrogated, and often executed. The message was brutal and effective. Don't think too much. Don't ask too much. Don't read what isn't approved. Religion presented itself as the defender of truth, but in reality it acted as the guard dog of a monopoly on storytelling. One of the most famous cases is Galileo Galilei in the 17th century. Armed with a rudimentary telescope, he confirmed that the Earth revolves around the sun, a truth that seems basic today, but back then contradicted the Church's official cosmology. The reaction: Galileo was forced to publicly recant and condemned to house arrest until his death. Science had evidence, but religion had power. The conflict wasn't really about stars. It was about authority. Religious censorship wasn't limited to science. It reached literature, art, and philosophy. Works that promoted ideas of freedom or questioned social hierarchy were hunted down. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it helped spread forbidden texts. On the other, it pushed the Church to create indexes of banned books, blacklists constantly updated to stop the spread of dangerous ideas. Knowledge became contraband, and reading could be an act of rebellion. But control wasn't only external. The most effective control was internal. From childhood, believers were taught to distrust their own questions. Doubt was portrayed as demonic temptation. Thinking differently became synonymous with sin. So the most efficient censor wasn't the inquisitor. It was the believer's own conscience, trained to self-censor. The result was a society where millions accepted religion's limits as the natural limits of reality. This monopoly on knowledge let religious institutions preserve errors for centuries. Diseases that could have been studied earlier were instead seen as divine punishment. Natural disasters were blamed on the gods' anger instead of on climate or geology. Magical explanations suffocated scientific curiosity for a long time, slowing down human progress. And when an undeniable breakthrough appeared, religion absorbed it or reinterpreted it so as not to lose relevance. Fear of heresy left deep marks. Even today, many people feel uncomfortable asking questions about their faith, not because there are no answers, but because centuries of cultural repression have taught them that doubting is dangerous. Religion perfected a psychological mechanism in which the believer themselves protects the prison they live in. Admitting it was all a scam would mean accepting that they gave their life to an illusion, and that emotional blow is unbearable for many. The irony is that despite all this censorship, doubt never fully disappeared. There were always those who, risking their lives, decided to think for themselves. Those dissidents, often anonymous, kept the flame of curiosity alive. But religion learned to camouflage and endure. It didn't collapse under contradictions. It absorbed criticism and morphed, still presenting itself as guardian of truth, even when evidence proved it wrong. This chapter of silence and bonfires reveals religion's darkest face, an institution that preferred to destroy knowledge rather than lose power. And it raises a new, unsettling question. If religion could smother thought for centuries, what did it do with all the material wealth it amassed through blind obedience? How did it turn faith into a constant flow of resources? The answer takes us to the economic heart of the oldest scam in human history. Episode 6, The Price of Faith, the Economic Machine. So far, we've seen how religion fed on fear, propped up rulers, and monopolized morality. But no institution can last millennia on stories alone. Every power structure needs a material engine to keep it going. Religion found it in something as simple as it was brilliant. Turn faith into money. Convince millions that giving up their resources wasn't a loss, but an act of devotion. That's how the oldest and most stable economic machine in human history was born. The scene is universal. Peasants who barely have enough to survive walk up to a temple and leave offerings, grain, animals, coins. They do it with resignation, but also with hope. They've been taught that the more they give, the closer they get to salvation. Sacrifice gets sold as spiritual investment. The present gets poorer. But the promised future, paradise, eternal life, a better reincarnation, gets richer. It's an invisible contract in which the institution always wins. In Mesopotamia, over 4,000 years ago, temples were already economic hubs. They stored agricultural surplus, recorded transactions on clay tablets, and distributed resources. Priests controlled production, trade, and even loans. In Egypt, the god-king pharaoh constantly received offerings that kept the priestly caste in luxury, while peasants carried the load of building pyramids and temples. The pattern was always the same. Material wealth flowed from the masses to the religious elite, justified as sacred duty. Over time, the mechanism got more sophisticated. In Judaism, tithing was institutionalized. A tenth of all production had to be given to the temple. In medieval Christianity, the church not only demanded tithes, but also sold indulgences, money in exchange for forgiveness of sins. Just think about the genius of that scheme. Invent a spiritual debt, sin, and then sell the cancellation of that debt as an exclusive product. No one could access that grace without going through the hands of the clergy. Indulgences reached peak shamelessness in the 15th and 16th centuries. To finance monumental works like St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, papal envoys traveled from town to town selling forgiveness at different prices. The message was simple and terrifying: pay and save your soul, or risk your eternity. They even offered the possibility of freeing deceased relatives from purgatory. It was the total commercialization of fear and family love. Millions handed over their few coins to buy comfort, while the church amassed colossal fortunes, and the business didn't end there. Temples and monasteries accumulated land, often inherited from believers afraid of dying in sin. Entire wills left fields, homes, and livestock to religious institutions. Little by little, the medieval church became one of Europe's largest landowners. In some regions, it controlled up to a third of all farmland. The peasant worked the land, the noble took taxes, and the clergy collected both material rent and spiritual tribute. A perfect circle of economic extraction disguised as devotion. Visible wealth was on full display as proof of divine favor. Gold-covered temples, robes embroidered with precious stones, grand ceremonies. It all worked as propaganda. The message was clear: if the institution is rich, it's because God blesses it. And if you're poor, it's because your earthly sacrifice is the seed for a harvest in heaven. The brutal contrast between religious opulence and popular misery wasn't seen as injustice, but as part of God's order. The cleverest move of all was shielding this accumulation of wealth with tax privileges. In many societies, religious institutions were exempt from paying taxes, while ordinary citizens paid tribute to the king or the state. Temples could amass property and fortunes tax-free. With those resources, they bought more land, financed private armies, controlled universities, and even influenced the choice of rulers. What looked spiritual on the surface was, underneath, a massive economic apparatus. And then came another refined strategy: charity as marketing. Religions have always offered help to the poor, food for the hungry, shelter for the homeless, but almost never as something completely unconditional. Help came with strings attached: show up for services, accept the doctrine, commit to the faith. The hot meal or warm blanket had a logo stamped on it. What they got in return was loyalty. Charity wasn't an expense. It was an investment in image, influence, and new believers who would later give back much more than they received. Economic control was reinforced by psychological control. Whoever didn't tithe or didn't give enough was branded greedy, faithless, rebellious against God. The punishment wasn't just social, it was spiritual, eternal damnation. What peasant, what widow, what orphan would dare challenge that threat? Better to hand over the little you had than risk your soul. Over the centuries, this machine expanded. Religions built financial empires, bought into banks, controlled media outlets, invested in corporations, all under the cover of sacred institutions, tax-exempt in many cases. What looked like spirituality was, in practice, a sophisticated economic system that funneled wealth from millions of pockets into a few hands. So the inevitable question is, how could such an obvious scheme survive for so long without collapsing like any other scam? The answer lies in its skill at disguising itself as culture, tradition, identity. Because while a financial fraud can be taken down by law, religion protects itself with symbols and feelings. That's where its real genius lies, turning economics into something sacred. But there's still an even deeper layer to uncover. How did religion manage to turn the most exploited people into the most fanatical defenders of the system? In the next episode, we'll dive into the psychological heart of the scam, how victims were turned into gods, keeping a cycle of obedience alive across generations. Episode 7. Victims turned into guardians. So far we've seen how religion used fear, politics, morality, childhood, and money to build a structure of power that looked unbreakable. But one last piece remains, the most unsettling one. How did it manage to turn the very people it exploited into its fiercest defenders? This is probably the darkest trick of all, turning victims into guardians. Picture a medieval peasant who has handed over almost his entire harvest as tithe. His family is hungry, his kids wear rags, but he looks up at the church tower and feels proud. He tells himself his sacrifice isn't in vain, that it brings him closer to God. If anyone dares criticize the priests, that same peasant will be the first to defend them passionately. Why? Because recognizing the scam would be unbearable. It would mean admitting he gave what little he had in exchange for nothing. Faced with that possibility, the human mind prefers to cling to the illusion, rather than accept a lifetime of betrayal. This phenomenon echoes something described in modern psychology, Stockholm Syndrome, when a victim ends up identifying with their captor. Religion perfected that dynamic on a massive scale. Millions of believers over centuries have learned to protect the very institution that oppresses them, convinced that doing so is a sacred duty. The system doesn't sustain itself through external force, but through internal obedience. The process starts in childhood with symbols and rituals that embed themselves in identity. Growing up in a religious community means inheriting not just customs, but an emotional framework. The child who learns to pray at 5, who memorizes hymns at 7, who joins processions at 10, associates those practices with the safety of home, parents' love, and belonging to a group. By the time adulthood arrives and doubt appears, that doubt isn't just intellectual, it's emotional, social, and deeply personal. Questioning religion feels like questioning your family, your ancestors, your sense of belonging. Very few are willing to pay that price. Religion plays with this emotional inheritance like a magician. It doesn't just sell promises. It sells identity. And once identity is on the line, the mind becomes its best ally, even in silence. Those who suspect the scam often choose not to speak, because saying it out loud could mean isolation, rejection by their people, and guilt burned into their conscience since childhood. The most disturbing part is that this mechanism turns believers into active soldiers. They don't need direct orders from religious leaders to defend the system. They do it spontaneously, from the heart, convinced they're protecting the truth. They attack any criticism as if defending their own life. And in a way they are, because their whole life is built on that faith. History gives us stark examples. In the medieval Crusades, young peasants marched straight toward death, convinced they were giving their lives for God when, in reality, they were serving the political and economic interests of kings and popes. During the Inquisition, neighbors denounced their own relatives and friends out of fear of being accused of heresy themselves, thus reinforcing the institution's power. Today, we still see communities where the poorest hand their wages to millionaire religious leaders, and paradoxically, they are the ones who get most outraged when someone points out the hypocrisy. Religion turned obedience into virtue and doubt into sin. It turned submission into a sign of purity and rebellion into a sign of corruption. That way, the system no longer needed constant repression. Believers themselves watched over and punished any attempt at dissent. The circle was closed. The mechanism is reinforced with delayed promises. When someone suffers, they're told that pain is proof of faith. When someone fails, it's blamed on their lack of trust in God. When someone prospers, it's sold as divine blessing. Every success or failure becomes yet another argument to keep obeying. The believer never really wins, but always finds a reason to stay inside. It's a vicious circle, and escaping it requires almost superhuman courage. Religion's real victory isn't in promises of heaven or threats of hell. It's in having convinced millions of people, generation after generation, to become their own jailers, in getting the most oppressed to defend the very structure that oppresses them, convinced that breaking it would be worse than enduring it. But there's one last twist in this story. Because if religion managed to shield itself with fear, morality, wealth, and identity, how did it stay intact across scientific, philosophical, and cultural revolutions? How did it survive every crisis, adapt to every era, and remain alive up to today? The answer lies in its most dangerous ability, chameleon-like adaptation. In the next episode, we'll see how religion learned to change masks to survive forever, disguising the same scam with new words, new symbols, and new promises. Episode 8. The Scam That Never Dies, The Art of Adapting. If any human system has shown almost supernatural resistance, it's not because it's true, but because it knew how to shed its skin every time reality threatened to destroy it. Religion wouldn't have survived millennia without mastering the art of adaptation. That's its most unsettling power, showing up with a new face every time, even though the poison is always the same. When science proved that Earth isn't the center of the universe, scriptures that were once interpreted literally suddenly became metaphors. When Darwin explained the evolution of species, the same churches that condemned the idea as blasphemy ended up reinterpreting their texts as poetic symbols. What yesterday was sold as the immutable word of God, today gets repackaged as flexible parable. The contradiction doesn't matter. What matters is keeping the facade intact. Religion absorbs reality's punches like elastic. Instead of cracking, it bends and reshapes. In ancient times, it spoke of gods of thunder and sun. In the Middle Ages, it talked of sins and penance. In the modern world, it talks of energies, vibrations, spirituality, and mindfulness. It always offers the same deal: comfort in exchange for obedience, power in exchange for faith. The wrapping changes. The contents stay the same. The visual spectacle remains key. Embroidered robes, massive processions, temples lit up with gold or modern lights. It's all part of a social theater sending a silent but powerful message. Something bigger than you lives here. Something you can't challenge. Who dares question a leader wrapped in incense, solemn music, and crowds in a trance? The theatricality isn't decoration. It's the core of religious power. On top of this, you have the constant recruitment strategy. If in the past missionaries crossed oceans to expand the faith, today religions fill TV, radio, and social media. Many leaders are full-on celebrities, mixing music, slogans, and consumer products with doctrine. Faith turns into a lifestyle, so embedded in culture that questioning it feels like attacking society's identity itself. Even in the most secular countries, religion survives as custom. People pray at weddings and funerals. They swear on holy books in court. They repeat phrases like "God bless you" without thinking twice. This is the scam's last mask. Hiding behind cultural tradition, as something normal and routine. That way, even if faith grows weaker, the system remains alive in language, holidays, and family rituals. In the end, religion hasn't survived because it revealed eternal truths, but because it learned to pick the right mask at the right time. When fear stops working, it offers hope. When science threatens, it adapts. When political power wobbles, it sides with the new winner. It's a living organism that changes shape to keep feeding on the same things: fear, hope, identity. And that leads to the final question. What can an individual do when faced with a system so deeply rooted in emotions and culture? It's not enough to have scientific evidence or point out historical contradictions. The real battle doesn't take place in temples or parliaments, but in each person's mind and heart. Because what keeps religion alive isn't the gods, it's the human need for comfort, belonging, and purpose. The challenge is enormous, learning to meet those needs without handing them over to institutions that feed off them. Building communities that offer real support, meanings that rise from freedom, hopes that don't depend on invisible promises. Breaking the scam doesn't mean living without meaning. It means creating that meaning ourselves. And that brings us to the end of this journey, but not the end of the reflection, because the oldest scam in humanity is still alive, camouflaged, waiting for us to let our guard down. The question is, will we keep acting as guards of the prison, or will we dare to break the bars? If this analysis made you think differently, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and share your experience in the comments. Have you ever felt trapped in a system that demanded everything from you in exchange for nothing you could really touch? Your story might help someone else wake up. Thanks for staying with me until the end. This is not the end. It's the beginning of a conversation, because questioning the unquestionable is the first step toward real freedom.